on.
Yes, okay.
Those very badly behaved people at the back just standing there and nattering. Or perhaps we haven't started yet.
Can we start? I want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming and for forsaking your lunch break to be here. If those of you who are sitting in the back would like to come up front, it might be a cozier atmosphere and easier to hear one another. So please do feel free. You have handouts on the table, on your benches, which we'll be referring to in the course of our talk. And let me start by introducing everyone. Won't you come up front a bit, because you're so far away, it just doesn't seem right. Do come up, and then we can talk rather than speak. Please do. Thank you. Yes, please.
Excellent. Do you have to hold the thing to make it?
No, I don't think so.
No.
Okay. That's much nicer. It's a nice atmosphere. Thank you. So, this is our translation slam. Despite its name, it's not militant, it's not aggressive. It is a nice way to talk about translation and how literary translators do what they do and ply their magic. I don't know if you can ply magic, but they do. My name is Christina Pribićević-Zori. I am also a literary translator, which is why I'm so interested in this panel. And we have two sterling translators with us today. One is Celia Hawkesworth, who, where shall I begin? Who for many, many years was a senior lecturer in Serbian and Croatian at the School for Slavonic Studies at the University of London, University College London. Equally important, she has a slew of wonderful translations that she has done. She's an award-winning translator and a very modest person. So I'm trying to give you some scope. Will Firth is a leading translator. He translates from Russian, from Macedonian, and from what at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where I once worked, we used to call BCS, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, please do note, in alphabetical order. Will has translated, among the many things he's translated, he's done a lot. He's also translated two books by the author we'll be discussing today. The author is three. Oh, I'm so sorry. I missed one. Okay, three, even better. The author we'll be discussing today, although you don't have to know the original language, let me say that immediately, because this is about the translator's mind, not about the writer's skill, the author's skill. The author's name is Andrej Nikolaidis, and as you may gather from his name, he comes from a Montenegrin Greek background. He was born in Sarajevo and grew up there, I think, and lives in Montenegro, and now writes in Montenegro. We're going to do several things. Translators are always also preoccupied with nuance, so we're going to also broach that subject. But before we do, let me tell you about the text that these two translators have been asked to translate. 1,000 words approximately, from the opening lines of a book that is one continuing sentence over 103 pages. So you can imagine how this has tested the mettle of our translators. It is a book that's kind of an imaginary history of Balkan and European exile in the last and this century. It takes place on a train, and there's a kind of stream of consciousness, which is, of course, why it can be one continuing sentence, or must indeed be. Today, what we're going to do is, with these handouts, which I hope I'll be able to help you refer to, we're going to sort of explore how these two very different translators approach, but not just approach this text, how they handle it, how they did these translations. In an earlier conversation a few minutes ago, I was saying to Celia and Will that my feeling is that the personality of the translator willy-nilly also comes through in the translation. And you might agree or not with me after we have had our 45, 50-minute exploration of their translators' minds. And then there'll be a question and answer period if you have any questions. So, I mentioned the word nuance, and I will get to that in a minute. But before that, I just want to ask some sort of general questions so you get an idea, again, of how they work. And my first question is, how many drafts do you do? Celia, how many drafts of your translation do you do?
As I do it always online, I've really no idea. Because it changes all the time. And every time we look at it, change something. So I'm really sorry. That's a pretty uninteresting answer, but I've no idea.
Will?
It's basically the same with me. I think I'm a fairly mechanical translator. I start off with a lot of sort of really rough goings through the text, and I don't know if it's 10 or 15 or whatever, but it's lots and lots of different journeys through the text, and finally sort of have a fairly polished version at the end, but it varies. Okay.
Well, there is a very well-known translator, sadly deceased, of Italo Calvino and Eco, and his name is William Weaver. And he used to give a summer course at Columbia University on translation, which was called Simple Words. And so I want to start, and before I do, you need to know these two colleagues have not seen each other's translations until this moment. So they're in the same boat as you are. I noticed that one translation leaves out the definite article in the title, and the other includes it. Now, in the original language, there are no definite articles. So it is really what the translator decides. So my question is, how did you come to not include or include the definite article in terms of simple words?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
I decided to include the definite article, and one reason, I think the main reason for me, was that the word sentence is ambiguous in English. It has multiple meanings. In the original, Mađarska rečenica just refers to a sentence in language. However, a sentence can also be the verdict of a court. You are sentenced to something. And it struck me that the fate of one of the protagonists, he's sort of sentenced to exile and sentenced to die in mysterious and unfortunate circumstances, that there is something of a sentence there in that otherworldly or maybe legal sense, whatever. So I thought it wouldn't hurt to cover that aspect by including the direct, the and that seemed to cover both meanings.
Okay, Celia?
Okay, I didn't, but for much the same sort of reasons. I like the ambiguity of the word sentence, so it can stay open throughout the whole text. I think I don't like the in titles a lot anyway, I think. So I think I discounted it quite quickly.
Do you, when you're translating, do you read what you're translating aloud to yourselves, Will?
Only when there are big difficulties and when I'm struggling with something, then I will, but generally I don't.
Celia?
No, I usually do at some point, but usually when I feel I've got reasonably near the end of the process to make sure that it sounds all right orally. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'd like to take this now to the specifics. So, if you would take your handout, there is a section of this early on, and that is under Hungarian Sentence, the end of line 3 from the top, and under the Hungarian Sentence, also the end of line 3. And if you look at that, you will hear the following. Under Hungarian Sentence, it says, dragging me towards a city in which he wanted to live and, of course, to end, to steal away, as he put it. Under the Hungarian Sentence, it says, towards the one, meaning city, towards the one where he wants to live and obviously die, peg out, as he used to say. So these are two different choices, and my question is, and I have to ask you first, Will, how did you hit upon peg out?
I knew you would ask this. Okay, well, we have this root verb 4 times in the first page of the translation. Ishunjati se, and that occurs 3 times, and there's one ushunjati se. The root meaning of this verb is to approach something, move up to something carefully, quietly, perhaps from behind, whatever. That's the root meaning. The actual colloquial meaning of this verb, it's often used in the sense of to scram, to vanish, to disappear. And I admittedly had difficulty rendering this verb in a literal way, like Celia has done, steal away, steal into, stole away. I only kept one of those, the steal into. Otherwise, because it was referring to death, because it was referring to his escaping from life, if you like, his sneaking out of life, I decided to choose a colloquial way, a bluntly colloquial way of rendering that in English. That was my reasoning, and that's how I got to peg out. I could have said to cark it or to die miserably, some synonym for that. That's why I chose peg out anyway.
Okay, I have to add, we have 3 versions of the English language at this table. Will is Australian, Celia is British, and I'm American. So, when I saw peg out, I thought, oh, that must be something very modern. Wrong. It's from the end of the 19th century, and it is anything but modern. I just thought it's sometimes very useful to look up things in the dictionary, especially when you think you know what you're talking about, which I didn't. So, Celia.
Yeah, I think it's. I didn't realize it was that old myself, but it does to me sound more colloquial. And I think I just didn't know enough about the whole text to be able to judge whether that was a more appropriate tone. So, and I like the fact you could do things with stealing that was sort of, it was more easily manipulated than just pegging out.
So it's also how you hear it, isn't it? I mean, when you're translating and you were hearing one thing and Celia another, two very different things. But Will mentioned repetition in this text, in these 1,000 words. There are words that repeat themselves quite often. And you will notice that in one text there is repetition and in another not in the translations. So I have to ask Will, I know that editors sometimes advise writers and translators to avoid repetition. And that is a choice a translator really can and has to make. So let me ask you, Will, you chose not to follow the repetition of, let's say, to steal away, to steal into, etc., etc. What was your thinking? This is what I'm interested in, the thinking.
Yeah. Just to go back a small step,
Yeah.
Celia and I come from different countries. I should also mention that I know the author relatively well, and having translated 3 books of his, I'm obviously thinking about that, thinking about things I've heard from him, and I'm reading things into his text perhaps. I try to restrain myself, but it could be that makes me, in some instances, freer than I ought to be. Just thought I'd mention that. Now, in terms of the repetition, yes, I'm one of those translators who thinks repetition should be avoided unless it's there for some special effect. My general impression about Serbo-Croatian is that authors often repeat words and phrases and phenomena much more than we would in English, where we perhaps expect. It's a matter of authors and readers and editors' expectations. We often expect more variety, more up and down and so on, whereas repetition for most readers of a Serbo-Croatian novel is not a huge problem. I had that in my mind. So that was, I admitted that I had a translation problem with the sneaking. I wanted to vary that and make it more sort of colloquial, but I think that you might find some other instances in the translation where I have also tried to avoid repetition, and that's conscious. It's conscious on my part.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, there's some real point in the repetition, and admittedly there is in a few instances. This train trip is long and monotonous. It's all in one sentence. It's very rhythmical in parts. And I think there are also instances where I have maintained a bit of that rhythm, but maybe less than Celia. I don't know.
Celia?
No, I think because verbs are such a problem, translating verbs from Serbo-Croatian into English are difficult because you've got all this wonderful flexibility with prefixes and ways of making the end of the verb longer, so that you get different tenses built into the simple verb. I was relieved to find something, if you could do something similar with stealing in, stealing out, stealing away. So I was happy to be able to use a bit of repetition, because it seemed to me that was true to the original.
Did it make a difference to either one of you that you knew this was going to be this text used in this way at a translation slam? Did it make a difference to you in the process of translating, how you translated?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I knew at the point when I was doing it what a translation slam looked like. It's when you sent the video clips. But no, I think I would always just try to make it sound what acceptable English to me, and as true as I know how to the tone of the original. So I don't think so.
Well,
obviously I was aiming for acceptable English as well, but I think I was fairly nervous doing this, and perhaps a bit more cautious than I otherwise would have been. So I think doing a normal translation job, I might even have been freer.
Yeah. So there was am I understanding correctly, there was a certain self-consciousness? Yeah. Indeed. All right. Well, words. Okay. This is not a simple word, despite William Weaver's talent in choosing simple words. One of the things that comes up in translation is words that are immediately recognizable in the original to a reader of the original language, and that don't have to be quite foreign in English, but are not really that familiar. So one of the words is in the original para polizia, which actually does exist in English, not that you'll hear it very often in an English-speaking context, para police. If you look at so under Hungarian Sentence, if you look at the 12th line from the bottom, you will see it says, only to face snipers, dogs, and a wall on the Hungarian border. Fascistic special police. So they are special police. In the Hungarian Sentence, it says only to come up against, 11 lines from the bottom of the Hungarian Sentence, only to come up against snipers, dogs, and a wall at the Hungarian border. Fascist vigilantes. So, how did you, when you came up against para-police, what were you thinking? Celia?
I was thinking it was an unfamiliar concept to me. I think vigilantes is really helpful because we do know what that means.
Yes.
I don't think special police means anything particular. So I would definitely think vigilantes was a good solution.
Will?
I imagined that these were sort of self-organized right-wing militias that perhaps pretended to be police authorities, or they may have the support of the state police. That's me being very free again with the vigilantes. Yes.
Yeah, I have to say, in an American context, vigilantes, especially these days, is a very familiar concept. Punctuation, because a translator has to stay true to the original, as faithful as a translator can. But in a book that isn't stream of consciousness, I would say that a translator very often adapts the punctuation to English punctuation. So, for instance, in all variants of Serbo-Croatian, when there's dialogue, you don't have a quotation mark, you have a dash. That's not just in these languages. Whereas that you can't do in English, or you can, but it's foreign. So, we're dealing now with 1,000 words of a running stream of consciousness sentence here. And I wanted to ask you about, because I noticed something in the punctuation. And that is page 2 of Hungarian Sentence. And that's the end of line 4 from the top. It says, and asked, the two of you had been, I assume, close, to which I replied, end quote. Under the Hungarian Sentence, also page 2, line 5 from the top, it says, and asked me, the two of you were close, I suppose, to which I replied. So now, what was your approach to punctuation in this stream of consciousness in terms of the English version? Will?
Let me just find the original. Yeah, the original does not begin with a comma after and asked, and I didn't really feel a need to. I wanted to sort of, in that commas are the main form of punctuation in this excerpt, in the book. I wanted to minimize them. Mm-hmm. That was my main reason there. Celia and I both used italics for the same purpose, I guess. Although they're in the original as well, aren't they? And my utterance, the way I've rendered it, is only interrupted by one, whereas Celia has, 2 or 3? So yeah, minimizing the use of this main punctuation means, I think, was what was foremost in my mind.
Celia?
Well, we have both used the convention of putting it into italics, putting the direct speech in italics. So I'm not sure that the punctuation marks the we've used are terribly important here, but we've both chosen to go with the italics. Yeah?
Do you think they're important, Tina? Here?
Well, I was just thinking about, you see, I read my translations aloud, and I read them with commas in my voice.
Yeah.
So whether they're in, so I don't know what I would do with this text, because I suspect I might put a comma because I would read it aloud and here this is where you need to pause, take a breath, and I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. So I don't know how to answer that. But what I'm trying to show is the different ways that people approach something as simple as a comma. Translators are very often thought of by non-translators, I think, as sort of can't see the forest from the trees, all into the details, etc., etc. And I think the trees do very much exist, but in order to see them, you really have to deal with the details as well. And this would be an example. Okay, register. This is something that all translators will mention and have to deal with, and that is hearing the tone of the original, hearing the tone of different voices. And I wondered how the two of you coped with this, the register of, on the one hand, this train and the monotonous turning of the wheels that you can imagine, and then the fact that the narrator talks who is in the here and now, by the way. The narrator is now in the 21st century, but he refers to Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin was a century and more before now. So, a philosopher, German philosopher. So, I wondered how you incorporated these different time frames in your translation. Or did you feel that the here and now covered everything?
No, it was very complicated. I mean, the sentence that we've just been looking at, I puzzled for a while about. So the direct speech was the two of you had been, I assume, close, and what the narrator wanted to react to was the idea that they had been but weren't any longer. So I puzzled a bit about how to do that, because of course the pluperfect doesn't exist in Serbo-Croat. So I found that interesting, and shifting between the different time frames had to be conveyed somehow in verb forms, tenses.
I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
No.
Will?
In terms of being faithful to the register, I think I very much thought about what's acceptable here and now. I know that the author is fascinated by Thomas Bernhard and stylistically tries to copy or imitate, echo a few of his things. What we haven't mentioned is that there's a quote by Stefan Zweig at the very beginning of the novel, who, as you may know, was a Jewish German intellectual, ended his life by suicide in 42? Really? Okay, that's not so important, but there's that the whole tragic sort of aspect of migration and threat of deportation, that sort of stuff. I had that in mind, but I didn't let it influence me in terms of my choice of words.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, choice of words. There was a French-English translation slam that was filmed, and I think all three of us saw this slam on our computers before joining you here today. And one of the things I personally found very interesting was the word insect. In the original French text, there is an insect so stated, flitting around. One translator translated it into English as insect. The other translator translated it as moth. And the reason she gave for translating it as moth was the word flitting, because she said she didn't really think of insects flitting. In her mind, this is what I mean about how a translator thinks. In her mind, insects crawled. They were on the ground. Now, one might say gnats flit, or I can think of various unpleasant insects that flit. But so she decided that it wouldn't hurt the text in any way, but might clarify this moth. So she said moth. Okay, this brings me to snakes. In this text, there is mention of an enormous snake, and you'll find it on page 2 of Hungarian Sentence. That's the end of line 4 from the top. And you'll find it on page 2 of the Hungarian Sentence, which is line 5 from the top. Oh, sorry, I've just given you the wrong thing.
I haven't found
My
it yet.
apologies. Sorry, that's from something we've already dealt with. Anyway, the word in the original is somebody was devouring, a priest was devouring his audience like an, quote, enormous snake. That's a literal translation. One translator said enormous snake, and another translator said anaconda. So how, Will, did you get to anaconda?
I would have liked to stick to enormous snake, but there are lots of enormous snakes. I know that as an Australian and not, well, I thought
Personality, I'm telling you.
the power and majesty of an anaconda is also an image in itself, and I felt that would be a good way of conveying this particular image. And we're not talking about a real snake, we're talking about this person devouring his audience like an enormous snake. So admittedly, I did think for a while about conveying it faithfully, word for word. Zmiurina, was that right? Enormous snake.
Golema zmija.
Golema zmija. No, I'm actually happy with my translation. I think it it fits the sort of semi-polemic, slightly exaggerated, sort of the hyperbole of the text. I think it's appropriate.
Celia?
I have to say, it didn't occur to me to make it a specific snake, just because it wasn't a specific snake in the original. I do like anaconda, and it has, you know, a lot specific connotations where enormous snake doesn't at all. So I don't know. I bow to Will.
The point, as I said at the beginning, is it's not really, it is a comparison, but it's not a question of judging or one better, one worse. It's just how a translator's mind works. At another translation slam, this one was from Spanish into English. Both very well-known translators. One translated the phrase in the morning as in the morning. And the other translator translated it as come the dawn. And the entire audience sighed because it was so beautiful. The first translator said, yeah, it is, it's just beautiful, but I said in the morning because that's actually what it said. And the other translator, who is Irish, said, oh, I know, but you know, translators never get any attention at all. And I thought it was time we just wow the audience. So, do you ever want to wow the audience, Will?
No, but I'm glad you like my anaconda.
Celia?
Well, only by being as faithful as possible, I think. Yes, you want it to sound as good as the original does.
Yeah.
But no, I don't. I'd rather as little as possible of my own personality crept in.
Well, I think the Australian anaconda will never be forgotten.
There are no anacondas in Australia apart from the zoo.
Okay, so how do you pick your writers? Do you, I mean, I know sometimes and often one is commissioned to translate someone. is there a certain kind of writing that you feel more comfortable in, Celia?
Yeah, definitely. And I really don't feel very comfortable with a personality that comes across in a text that I'm not in sympathy with and I don't really understand. So I would be quite selective. There's this lovely word in sauerkraut about lying. Something lies for you. And so it has to lie in my head comfortably.
Will?
I tend to like short stories, which are very hard to find publishers for, and short novels by writers roughly my age, plus or minus 5 or 10 years. And since I make a living as a literary translator, I can't afford to be too picky. So unless there's something about the book that I really detest, if it's outwardly nationalist or homophobic or sexist or something like that, I'll usually accept the job. And there are lots of authors that I myself try to promote and find a publisher for as a kind of an informal agent, but that rarely works. So in those cases, I actually try to be a bit more oriented towards what the market might want rather than what I myself like.
Okay, so you get a text that you're translating. It's not something you detest, so you've agreed to do it, but it's not quite your style. It's not your register. How do you approach it? How do you deal with... Takeout is a very good example because it's, and I'm not picking on it, what I'm trying to say is it fits a certain tone. So generally when you have a tone in an original that is not your natural tone, what do?
I don't have a set answer to that. I don't have a particular approach. I think through communication with the author and having read the book, that helps me be a chameleon. That's what a translator should be, not to have his or her own style really, although that's unavoidable to an extent, but to really try and adapt, to be a shadow or a little coloured copy, like a chameleon of the author. I relate to Andrej Nikolaidis' writing because there's a lot of irony and a lot of wordplay in it. But I can also translate fairly stodgy, stolid authors as well. I just try and sort of fit into that mood and that mode, and I hope it works. I think I'm fairly malleable.
I guess what I'm getting at, and there I'll move on to Celia, is to what degree do you find sometimes that you feel you need to improve on the original? That the translation needs to be better than the original, basically.
Okay, and that would be a hard judgment to make. Let's say there are some things which work well in the original language which are not going to work in English, so then you have some leeway to maybe improve. But I was just thinking, and Susie may know who I mean, but I did do a volume of short stories fairly recently in which I was not in sympathy, but that also gives you kind of freedom because you can be somebody else. Try and get inside this completely different woman's head and make something of it. So there's always something to be done, and it can be quite fun.
Can I take you both back to your early days as translators and ask you, when you were still very dependent on dictionaries for the original into English, words that you had to look up because you were still developing your knowledge of the language you're translating from, did you feel then freer when you didn't quite know what a word meant, but you could get the gist? Or do you feel freer now when you know exactly what the word means and you have to decide whether to stick to it or not?
No, far freer. No, far more in control. It was absolutely terrifying when I began because I just happen to be in Belgrade, and I happen to vaguely know Serbo-Croat, and I happen to be British. And so it was assumed that I could do it. And it was terrifying. And they also wanted it done now, or yesterday. So, no, very frightening. However, I have to say that with advancing years, I do find I'm using the dictionary much more than I have been recently, because I can't remember the English word. I know it, I know what it means, but I just don't have the instant recall. That's when I was absolutely terrified when Susie suggested this slam, and I thought, does it mean we're going to be improvising? Because I can't.
Will?
Similar with me, I'm a lot freer now than I was maybe 15, 20 years ago, which is partly to do with having a better grasp of the source language, but also perhaps not being so mesmerized by the original. They have a term in Russian that I like, the hypnosis of the original. I don't relate to the books I translate with the same awe as I did in the past, so I feel able to be freer. And it's funny, I also use dictionaries just as much as I did 20 years ago, either because I've forgotten the correct or one of the main English translations, but also to look for synonyms.
Yes, sure.
A good dictionary will give you several options, and it doesn't mean you have to stop thinking with your own head, but just to have on paper a range of translation options is useful, I find.
Do you find you have at your fingertips the same synonyms that repeat themselves in whatever translation you do?
I think in most instances I will find something in a dictionary, but there are instances where I'll say, that's okay, that's no good. And sometimes I'll think up something myself, increasingly often, because I'm not satisfied with the dictionary solutions.
Celia?
I've got a great, the Longman synonym dictionary, which I couldn't do without, I don't think, or indeed the thesaurus online. Tremendous, because things do go out of your head, or they get lost, buried.
When you're translating, again, people translate in different ways. Gregory Rabassa was a very well-known translator for Marquez, Gabriel Marquez. And he said that he would translate, that's why I asked about drafts, he would do a first draft in which he would include everything that was in the original, no matter how it sounded in English. And then he would take that finished first draft and go through it. So, having given you a lead-in into one translator, how do you translate? I know you said you correct as you go along, but...
Yes, but when I feel I've finished the first draft, I put it away, and as far as possible, forget about the original, and then read it through for its own sake. And then, it's a very long process, and then I can compare it with the original again, just to make sure I've not gone completely mad somewhere along the line or missed something. But it's a very slow process. And, I admire Will for, having to live as a translator, because it's so slow, and the rewards, the financial rewards, bear no resemblance to the amount of time that goes into it.
Well,
I also start with an almost one-to-one English transcript, if you like, of the original, and then gradually whittle it and bash it into shape and compare it with the original along the way, until it very gradually takes shape.
Yeah.
And apart from, even if you do have to live off of translation, what is it that, how can I put it? What is it that gets you going with translation? What is it that gets you obsessed with translation? If you do get obsessed, I don't know.
I do. It's a bit of a battle, just dealing with the nitty-gritty every day and having fun finding solutions. It's a bit like a game in a way, or a bit like a word game, a bit like playing Scrabble 60 hours a week or something like that. Well, not quite, but it's fun as well, although there are also times when I have to force myself to work. I think for me it's not so much the book reader's pleasure of having a fine finished product, not even so much the ego of being able to present a book and have it to one's name, but it's very much this personal enjoyment or personal struggle with texts on an almost daily basis. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Celia?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I have to say I feel it's kind of second best to being a creative writer yourself. And if you haven't got that in you, then it's a wonderful way of interacting, as Will has said, with the nitty-gritty of language. It's a real privilege.
Do you find you learn your own language better through translation?
Definitely.
And how is that? Is it because you learn to stretch it beyond what you thought was possible? Is it?
Well, you get out of your own head. So you're looking at the world through other people's eyes, and that gives you scope to use language in a slightly different way depending on the original, and also you're just very, very much more conscious of language.
Will?
Yes, for me, working as a translator is also a way of deepening and extending my knowledge of English. And I have a particular example. For the last 2 years, I've been translating mainly for US publishers. And it's an official secret that I have never actually been to North America. And for quite a while, I struggled with fairly rigid conceptions of, American vocabulary, that they always would say streetcar and never tram and stuff like that, and 101 other examples. I mean, obviously, I did my best, and I still do, and I sort of produce mid-Atlantic English with American punctuation and spelling. But just the last few years have really opened my mind. I think it's 4 books in a row that I've done for US publishers. And the editors have found the books fine, good even. Perhaps they've needed to invest a bit more in the editing than they would in editing the translation of an American translator. But that's been a real eye-opener. It's learning American English, learning by doing sort of thing.
We will not discuss what all I had to learn in translating into British English. Celia, have you had things published outside of Britain where what Will is describing also apply?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and quite often there's quite a lot of intervention, some of which I regret. But I also I always aim for something vaguely mid-Atlantic so that it's readable by both groups of people.
Can I give you an example of what we're talking about? I translated something for an American publisher. But I've been living outside of the States for a long time, and I lived for a long time in the Balkans. And so, when the word container appeared in the original, in this case, Serbian text, container, I thought, oh, I know what that is. That's a wheelie. Wheelie is, I think, that's what I was told by Brits, it's where you put your garbage, right? Wheelie bin. Sorry, got even that one. Wheelie bin. Yes, well then it got to New York, and in New York they said, what is a wheelie bin? And we all learned it's a dumpster. So it's just one word, but it's simple words. I mean, to go back to William Weaver, and I truly do suggest, if you've got the time, go on the internet. You will see his lectures on the subject of simple words. Whether you say buongiorno in the north of Italy or whether you say it in the south of Italy is a time issue. Mm-hmm. In one part it means late afternoon, early evening, and in the other part of Italy it means good day. I'm throwing this all out because that's what I meant when I said the original language in the sense of our discussion isn't really that important. It's what you have to deal with as a translator, how much you have to know, or at least know that you don't know, and search for it. And with that, I open up the floor if you have any questions for any of us. Yes, there'll be a mic coming your way.
Could I ask a question? Could I ask a question about rhythm? To what extent, if at all, does the original text reflect the da-dum, the rhythm of the train? And to what extent, if at all, did you attempt to reflect this in your translations?
I can give a short, very general response, shall I? Simply to the effect that there is a fair bit of repetition in the text, repeating the personal pronoun on, he, more than one needed to in the original. When the living protagonist is reflecting on his dead friend, he did this, he did that, he did da. That sort of mechanism, I guess, creates a bit of the replicates the movement of the train. I felt that, or I imagined that I felt that. And in general, there is a fair bit of repetition, which I obviously didn't stick to, as we've seen with sneak into and sneak out of. But that's all that I can really think of at the moment in terms of replicating the train's movement. What do you think, Celia?
Yeah, well, I have to say I didn't really consider. I tried to reproduce what I thought was the rhythm of the original, which didn't, to me, read as tum-to-tum-to-tum. Except that there is something about the fact that it's all one sentence, which gives you that kind of slightly soporific sense of perhaps a long journey. But generally, rhythm is crucial. And that's why reading aloud seems to me very important. Yeah.
So I would like to ask a question about the very specific thing that I think many people here might be surprised to hear the name of the language Montenegrin. And they might want to know more about what that language is, what its roots are, how similar it is to Serbian, etc., etc. Can you tell us something? Obviously I know, but for the benefit of everyone else, could you tell us something about the specifics of that language?
Well, my starting point always with this language, which I taught for very many years at the University of London, was that I would tell students when they came it was the most cost-effective language to learn, because you learn one, but you come out knowing five. I'm not sure I could say what the specifics are, I'm afraid. I'm sure a Montenegrin could.
Yes, I mean, Will, you've recently spent quite some time in Montenegro, so
yes.
Perhaps, yeah. You were there when it was made an official language, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think we really do need to emphasize that it's one of the main standardized versions of the language that used to be called Serbo-Croatian. The degree of lexical, phonetic differences is really minimal. Everyone in that area can understand each other perfectly well, unless they descend into their own regional dialect and sociolect, but we can do that in the English-speaking world as well, and then you can be utterly incomprehensible to others. But basically we are dealing with one polycentric language. Montenegrin is just one of those variants. Since the independence of Montenegro in 2006, the authorities have been trying to introduce more specific Montenegrin factors into the vocabulary, into the spelling. 2 new letters have been introduced into the alphabet. That might sound like a major operation, some kind of prosthetic device. They actually fit the phonetic structure of the language very well, but that's a strange development, trying to make the language visibly different to Serbian, to Croatian, to Bosnian, and so on. I'm not sure what to think about that. And having spent a while in Montenegro now, I'm aware of quite a few different turns of phrase and different semantics with some words and particularisms and stuff. So, I mean, I think we can treat it as a variant of the language in its own right. The fact that only, 600,000 people live in that former Yugoslav republic doesn't affect the argument. It is something unique in a way, but not separate. It's part of this Serbo-Croat family, if you like, linguistically speaking. That's what I'd say.
Thank you.
Hi, Yaton here from Kosovo. What a wonderful bunch you are! I think it's a marvelous thing. I absolutely, I grew up, Albanian speaking, and I learned all my books from reading Cyrillic or Montenegrin or Croat versions. So I had to kind of really adapt to those languages. But what happened later, when I learned English, I read also the originals, and I'm not showing off. But what I found is that perhaps it was my age, or perhaps it was the way I saw the world, is that in some of the books, which I will not name, I read in 3 languages, but then I came to love not the original, but the translation. Mm-hmm. Now my question is, what happens is that I'm sure if this happens, the translation actually makes it better, it improves it. What I want to know, and I know this, I'm not asking for confirmation, I want to know without specifically naming someone, have you ever had an author who came and said, "Svaka vam čast," or "Well done you," for improving either a paragraph, a bloody line, or the whole book? So, that's my answer. Well, I mean, my question. My answer came before.
Celia.
That would be a wonderfully modest writer. There are people who've been happy with the way the translation has worked, but I can't imagine improving. Anyway, well, maybe with that particular, yes. Maybe in that case.
Sorry.
I've had that compliment made a few times, but I don't know how often it's honest and how often it's flattery, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I can give you another version. I've had an author whose knowledge of English was what I would call a working knowledge, but not more than that. Go through every page I translated, and wherever I had a problem, meaning the English, I hope, was correct and sounded decent enough, but I did have a problem in the translation. Wherever I had a problem, he checked it, he felt it. And it's the most extraordinary experience when an author hears, without actually knowing the details of what you're doing, but he hears that something is off key. Wow. And he was right every single time.
Very interesting.
So that was a lovely experience.
Yeah.
I think that says also about my own problems, but I mean, it was a really wonderful experience. Yeah. Well, we're almost at the end. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Linguistic clairvoyance, that's brilliant.
I'll
Very
tell you
clever of
about
him.
it. That was
I just
wonderful.
had a quick question. How do you approach translating
sorry.
slang?
I can't hear you.
How do you approach?
Can you fix the mic?
Okay. I just had a quick question. How do you approach translating slang? Translating slang
How do
into
you
English?
approach slang?
If it's just slang, then it should be possible to find something which is equivalent enough without being too specific to an area. Where you have a mixture of slang and a particular dialect, then you have, I think, an insoluble problem. So again, Susie knows that we worked on a lovely book which is set in Split, and where the most intimate dialogue takes place between members of the family. It's all in this Split dialect, and you can't properly. I bow to Will, who might have a solution, but I didn't. I couldn't find a solution that was going to be accurate enough without being giving quite the wrong kind of associations. So I just chose to use a kind of slightly substandard version of English. In that, but they're clearly educated people. It's a problem. But I think slang itself, we've got so much of our own that you can choose. I think there's enough there to choose something which is obviously substandard but not too specific geographically. Yeah.
Will?
Celia, were you just talking about Olja Savićević's novel? I was lined up to translate that shortly before you, but then another job came along, and I would have adopted exactly the same approach, basically, considering the slang hard to render, and therefore adopting a fairly standard approach in English without going overboard, but with a few slangy turns of speech here or there. It's generally a question I don't like dealing with. I usually groan and shuffle a bit in my chair when slang comes along, and try to use Australian slang whenever possible, but often that's not acceptable. Bloody hell, all the bloodies have to go out the window, and yeah, just adapt it to more towards American or British or some amalgam, depending on what the original demands. Tricky, always tricky.
I just wanted to ask the problem about translating a novel in one sentence. To what extent you had to make compromises in order to maintain the flow of the whole book?
Celia,
So wait a minute, Lisa.
what kind of compromises? To what extent did you have to make any compromises in the translation, considering that it's one continuous sentence?
Actually, I was dreading it, but found it wasn't that difficult because, I mean, first of all, you've got the evidence in front of you, but it seems that the author himself used various devices to break up the sentence, and one could simply go along with that. But it was a daunting prospect, I think.
I was also daunted more by the prospect than the actual experience. It was doable. But then again, there might be some junctures, if one translated the whole book, where it would be difficult with our relatively rigid word order. Serbo-Croatian's word order is much freer. It could potentially be difficult.
Yeah.
Any more questions? I actually have a question, and that is, when you have finished your translation and it has come out in print, do you read it?
Sometimes, and invariably on page 3, there's a glaring mistake.
Will?
I don't usually like to read my translations for roughly the same reason, but I often have a favourite passage or a paragraph that I will go back and read, and in that it's a favourite, I've usually done it well because I believe in it and feel it.
Yeah.
But I also grimace sometimes.
Thank you so much for helping us talk translation. For forsaking lunch, please go and have some now. And thank you.